I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson who answered the question of life's meaning by writing that we are here, that life exists, that the powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse. And that's beautiful. But what he missed is that verse that we contribute is worship itself. And that is stunning. Welcome to What We Long For, a podcast where we explore the deep desires of our hearts and how they find fulfillment in God. I'm Kristen, and today we are talking about worship, not as a practice, but as a way of being at home with God. For a long time, I thought of worship as something I entered into, something that happened in a specific place or moment. But then I experienced a season where worship just was not convenient, and it definitely wasn't easy. Life was overwhelming, and I felt disconnected from God, get alone a song or a moment or a church service. I kept waiting for the right moment, for the right church service, for a song that would bring me back into worship. But one day, while sitting in silence, I realized that God was already near. He wasn't waiting for worship. Worship was waiting for me to wake up to God's presence. And that shift, it changed everything. Worship became less about moments and more about movement, about living in constant awareness that I was already at home with God. If you have ever struggled to feel connected to worship, let's take a fresh look at what it really means. To start us off, let's turn to Acts 17:27-28, where Paul speaks to the people of Athens, addressing their search for meaning and the God they do not yet know. He says, "He is not far from each one of us, for in him we live, we move, and we have our being." Paul isn't speaking to those who already follow God. He's speaking to people searching for something greater. They had built altars to an unknown God, trying to worship something they couldn't yet grasp. And Paul tells them, you don't have to search far. The God you long for is already near. In him you live, in him you move, and it's in him that you actually exist. Worship isn't about bringing God near because he's already near. So much of our longing comes from feeling like we are distant from God, but this verse tells us we are already in his presence. If worship is how we live, how we move and exist, it isn't a scheduled activity. It's a very way of living our lives. This means that our daily lives can become an offering of worship simply by being lived with a heart tuned toward God. Every step, every conversation, every quiet moment can be an act of abiding in him. Friends, we were created to be at home with God. Just like a fish is made for water, we were made to exist in constant communion with God. We were made to exist in worship. When we live our lives outside of this awareness, we feel restless and disconnected and unsatisfied. But when we learn to remain in him, we find the peace in simply being with him. Worship is about dwelling, not striving. It's not about coming and going, it's about staying. And that's truly the core truth that I want to dive into in this episode. If worship is what we were created for, then it is more than a practice. It is the foundation of our existence. Worship is the natural response of a soul that has found its true home in God. But what does that really mean? At its core, worship is really about aligning ourselves with God. It's acknowledging who he is, responding to his presence, and allowing that reality to shape the way that we live, that we think, and that we love. When we worship, we are stepping into the very purpose for which we were created. Paul's words in Acts 17:28 weren't just poetic language. Instead, it's truth about the nature of worship. Worship is not an occasional activity. It is the very context in which our lives are meant to unfold. We are designed to exist in constant awareness of God's presence, to glorify and enjoy him in that to live in his nearness and naturally as we breathe. As we unfold this truth, there are three fundamental aspects of worship that I think it shows us. First, worship is how we live, as I've said. Life itself is a gift from God, and worship is the way that we acknowledge that reality. It's the way we show gratitude for that gift of life. To live in worship means that every thought, every action, and moment is offered back to God, not as a ritual, but as a response to his goodness. Worship isn't limited to structured times of prayer or praise. It is a posture of the heart that transforms the way in which we engage the world. Second, worship is how we move. Our daily decisions, work, relationships, the pursuits are not separate from worship. Instead, they are how we express it, the way that we treat others, the way that we handle our responsibilities, the way we choose to spend our time are all expressions of what we value and honor. Worship in motion is about letting God's presence inform how we navigate life, allowing Him to guide our steps so that we glorify Him in everything that we do. Third, worship is how we have our being. To exist in worship means that our identity is fully rooted in God. We are not defined by what we achieve, how others perceive us, or what we accumulate. We are defined by the fact that we belong to God. When we understand this, worship is no longer something we do, it's something that we are. Worshippers of our Creator. So what's the role of worship in aligning our lives with God? One of the greatest struggles in life is misplaced worship. Whether we realize it or not, we all devote ourselves to something, to our success, to our security, to our relationships, or even our own sense of control. The human heart is always worshiping. The question is not if we are worshiping, but what we are worshiping. Paul reminds us that we were made to exist in God, that in Him we find our truest reality. When our worship is rightly aligned, everything else falls into place. Worship is the means by which we recalibrate our lives. It is how we shift our focus from what is temporary to what is eternal, from what is fleeting to what is unshakable. When we misplace our worship, we experience anxiety and dissatisfaction and exhaustion. But when we align our worship with God, we step into peace and to purpose and to joy, not because our circumstances change, but because our souls are at rest in their true home. Worship is not an escape from reality. It is stepping fully into the truest reality of all. It's stepping fully into God's presence. As I've said, worship is truly about being at home with God. The beauty of it is that it's not about searching for something unattainable. It's about realizing that God is already near. We don't have to strive to be close to Him. We are already in His presence. And worship is about recognizing that reality and choosing to remain in it in everything that we do. When David writes in Psalm 27:4, "One thing I have asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life," he is expressing the deepest longing of every human soul, to be with God, to be at home, finally, and at last in Him. Jesus echoes this in John 15:4 when He says, "Abide in me and I in you." Worship is this abiding, this choosing to remain with God, not just a moment in prayer, but in every moment of life. The more we live with this awareness, the more worship ceases to be something separate from our daily lives. It becomes the very fabric of who we are. When we wake up, when we work, when we rest, when we serve others, when we reflect on the day, we do so in the presence of God. Worship is not an activity added to life. It is the atmosphere in which our life happens. And that is what we were made for. And so I want to take a moment just to reflect. Here's a question for you. In what ways have you made your home in something other than God? What would it look like for you to live truly, to move and have your being in Him? How can worship become less of an occasional practice you engage in and more of a way of being, more of a way of life? When we see worship as being at home with God, everything changes. It is no longer a place that we visit. Instead, it's a reality we live in. And when we embrace this truth, we find that we are finally where we were always meant to be. Friends, let's carry this with us as we move into what it means to live a life of worship. Moving into the underlying theology behind this concept, if worship is about being at home with God, if it is how we live and how we move and how we exist, then it's not something we add to our lives. Instead, it is woven into the very fabric of creation. From the beginning, we were made to exist in constant communion with God. Worship is not a duty or a ritual. It's literally our design, how we were made. In Genesis 3:8, we see that before sin entered the world, Adam and Eve walked with God in the garden. Their daily existence was inseparable from His presence. They didn't schedule time to be with Him. They simply were with Him. This is a picture of how humanity was meant to live, not reaching for a God, but abiding in Him, fully aware of His nearness and worshiping Him at all times, just by being with Him, just by being alive. But when sin entered the world, something tragic happened. Humanity's natural communion with God was disrupted. Instead of walking with him, Adam and Eve hid. They distanced themselves, and that distance has echoed throughout history. Worship was never meant to be something we struggled to engage in. It was meant to be as natural as breathing. Sin, however, distorts our instinct, drawing our attention to other things, causing us to build our lives and to worship lesser loves. Yet, throughout Scripture, we see that God's desire has always been to restore what was lost. It's in Exodus 25:8 that he commands the Israelites, "Let them make a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst." Even in a broken world, he makes a way to remain with his people. It's later in John 1:14 that we see the ultimate fulfillment of this desire. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus came to restore the nearness of God that had been fractured by sin. This is why Paul's words in Acts 17:28 are so powerful. It's in him that we live, that we move, and that we have our being. This is a reality that Jesus came to restore. Worship is not about drawing near to God, it's about awakening to the truth that he is already here. So what are truths underlying this concept? First, it's about recognizing that God is our dwelling place. In Psalm 90, verse 1, it declares, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations." From the beginning, God's presence has been our true home, and worship has never been a location. It's about an awareness. It is a way of being with God no matter where we are or what we are doing. This means that worship is not something that we step into and out of. Instead, it's where we remain. Second, worship is about participating in the life we were made for. Jesus invites us to abide in him in John 15:4. Not just to acknowledge him. To worship is to return to the fullness of life, to live in a way that reflects the reality of God's presence. When we embrace worship as a way of life, it transforms us. It changes how we respond to challenges, how we engage in work, and how we interact with others. From Genesis to Revelation, the entire story of Scripture is about God dwelling with his people. And worship, it's our response to that reality. It is the way we align ourselves with our original design, where our hearts, our minds, and our lives are in sync with God's presence. When we learn to remain with this awareness, we are no longer restless, searching for something more, because we've already found it. We are already at home in God. Friends, if you take anything, take this. Worship is not about us. It's all about glorifying God. Here are crucial things that we need to remember. First, worship is not about what we get from it. It's not about emotional highs. It's not about our personal preferences. It's not about us at all. Worship is all about God, about reorienting ourselves towards him as the center of it all. In a world that constantly tells us to put ourselves at the center, worship forces us to recognize that we are not the main character. It forces us to recognize that God is, that he is at the center of it all. And paradoxically, when we truly worship him, not for what he gives, but for who he is, we find the deepest joy and fulfillment possible, because we are living as he created us to live. This is why Psalm 16:11 says, "In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand there are pleasures forevermore." How crazy is it that when we stop worshiping the pleasure of this world, we find the true pleasure that will last for eternity? The joy we long for is found in dwelling with God. In the passage of scripture leading up to our focus text, we see that Paul is talking to the people of Athens about the altar of the unknown God. Worship is not a decision we make. It is the natural outflow of our being. Every single person is devoted to something, to building their life around what they believe will bring meaning, fulfillment, or security. And this isn't a modern struggle. It's a human reality that has always existed since the beginning. In Acts 17, the chapter we've been in, Paul arrives in Athens, a city full of altars and temples and idols. These weren't just meaningless statues. They were expressions of a deep longing. The people of Athens, despite all of their wisdom and all of their philosophy, had an altar to the unknown God. It was as if they sensed that despite their countless deities, something was still missing. They acknowledged a void, yet they didn't know how to fill it. It's in the midst of that Paul stands before them and he says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with the inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." This is Acts 17:22-23. The people of Athens were already worshiping. They just didn't know what they were worshiping. They were reaching for something beyond themselves, trying to satisfy a longing they couldn't name. And Paul tells them, the one you are unknowingly seeking has already made himself known. And then he goes even further. He is not far off from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. Paul's words here reshape everything. He tells them and us that worship isn't about finding God, but about recognizing that he is already drawn near. God does not need our temples or our altars. We are his dwelling place. We are not meant to search endlessly for something greater. We are meant to wake up to the reality that our lives were created and exist in him. It's very easy to see that we are a very religious people, worshiping all sorts of things. We may not build literal altars, but we structure our lives around things that promise meaning and security and fulfillment, whether it's success or relationships, reputation, comfort, an artist, a sports team, whatever it is. Like the people of Athens, we acknowledge a longing but often misplace our worship. Paul's words remind us that the God we are searching for is already near. The invitation is not to find him, but to return to him, to dwell in him, and to let our lives be fully aligned with the one in whom we already live and move and exist. Worship then is not about chasing an experience. It's about abiding in a reality. It's not about coming and going. It's about remaining. So here is my challenge for you this week. Let's identify our unknown altars. Paul blatantly and boldly stood before the people of Athens and pointed to their altar of the unknown God, a symbol of their longing and their searching for meaning, and ultimately their misplaced worship. They had this instinct, this natural draw to worship, but they had not yet recognized the one it was made for. But what about us? We don't really have anyone blatantly pointing out our altars. We may not have stone altars, but we build our lives around things that subtly take the place of God. We set up altars to our friends. We set up altars to our loved ones. We set up altars to our achievements, believing that they will fill us. We construct altars of approval, hoping that the right relationship will give us worth. We kneel at altars of security, convinced that control will bring us peace. These things aren't inherently bad, but when they become what we trust, what we chase, and what we sacrifice for, they reveal what we are truly worshiping. So here's the challenge. Ask God to reveal the altars in your life that you have built without realizing it. Where are you placing your deepest trust? What do you turn to for meaning and for comfort? What do you sacrifice your time, your energy, and devotion to? Take a moment to reflect and then ask yourself, how can I redirect my worship back to the one in whom I live, in whom I move, and in whom I have my being, my very existence? Friends, worship is not just something we do. It's the way we exist. It's our response to the presence of God, our recognition that he is already near. We're not striving for him. We are living in him. Worship is not a part of our life. It's the posture of our entire being. So as we close, I want to leave you with this. What would it look like for you to fully live in the reality that God is our home? What would it mean to let go of the altars you've unknowingly built and to truly rest in him? This week, take a few minutes each day to simply acknowledge God's presence, whether it's in silence or in scripture, in gratitude or in surrender. Not as a task, but as a way of coming home to the one who's already near. That is all that I have for you in today's episode. If today's episode spoke to you, feel free to share it with a friend or to reach out and to let me know how you are creating space to dwell with God. You can connect with me down in the comments or on social media at an affinity for beauty. We'll also be back next week with a Q&A about this very topic, so make sure to send in your questions. Friends, until next time, may you walk in the awareness that you are already at home.